Hello everybody, this is Jasmina. In this video I'm going to talk about finding the period of an old house. It can be a real challenge to find the correct period of an old house, especially if it has gone through several owners. Now, sometimes it's easier than other times, but I don't buy the idea that if you move into a new house, that is a new house for you, but it exists, that it's your move-in date that determines the period of the house. It can be if it's been on the market for over 90 days and you know that the original owners have been out of the house for 90 days, then it's borderline because there'll still be people looking at it. It should be okay. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes houses stay on the market for less than a week. So you have to know a lot about this house if you want to just use that as your move-in date is the time of the period. You have to know it's been on the market for at least 90 days. 100 days is even safer. Now, if you live in a location that requires permits, and most people do, but not everybody, uh, it they basically, if you're going to do any significant work like an addition or something like this, all that stuff is recorded. And it's recorded by the local authorities that govern building in that district or that area. So that is often a way to find some very good information. One way, of course, of changing the period of the house is being out of the house 90 consecutive days without people living there. And that would happen if a house is on the market for a long period of time and you know for certain from the agent or whoever that the family is not living in the house and has not been living in it for 90 days. I would say that's okay. That could change the period, but it really depends on the time in which you buy it. There are times when houses go in super quick time. And if there's been a lot of people and they've had an open house, it should be 90 days after the last open house because that is a lot of people, a lot of energy. It basically, you want it to be clear of much energy, much human energy for 90 consecutive days. Now, this can easily occur when the house is inherited, and if the new homeowners, the new owners that inherit the house, live in a different city, they're not going to move there. They have to figure out how to sell it. Sometimes it has to go through probates. I mean, it's all kinds of things. This can help you to help you determine whether or not this has happened. And usually, it will be clear that this, especially if you look at even the obituaries for that city, especially if it's a smaller city, you will know when the owner died, the old owner died, because this is all in the records. If you live in if you live in the United States, I think anywhere in Europe, all this will be known. And you can know when it was sold, that is assuming that whoever inherited it couldn't use it. So, because they work in a different city, for example. So you will have some idea, and you will know whether or not the house is empty for 60 days. Now, a quit claim deed, at least that's what it's called here in the United States, basically you quit your claim on a house. So if you want to give your house to your kids, you would often use a quit claim deed. And this is while you're still alive, of course, but this often happens when they come to take care of you, and you just don't want to deal with the hassle of the house and all the stuff. You know, you want to be rid of that responsibility. An older person will often do that, especially if they're finding they're not thinking as clearly as they should be. And they have a kid who is willing to take care of them in the house. Of course, they usually want to stay in the house. That's quite normal. So this sometime is an indicator. But this usually doesn't, it doesn't usually mean that there's 90 days. it depends on whether the person is still alive. And sometimes that can happen, I think, perhaps with some jurisdictions in a in an inheritance. And it's a little vague on me. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know for sure. But this is an indicator that the person is like giving up the rights to the house. And so that often means something big has changed. What that is sometimes a little unclear. But this is often an indication something's going on. Now, in addition or subtraction of 33%, that's one third, in either direction, either more or less, can change the period of the house. And this is almost always done by permit, or at least let's hope it's done by permit, uh, when this happens. Otherwise, it's illegal to do, and when you try to sell the house, it's a real hassle. But some people do it anyway. But this can help you uh, find out when this change occurred, and it will be told the old square footage, the new square footage, and it could go either way. And actually, even if it's a subtraction, you might not need a permit for that, but you would have the city or county or whatever inspect it so that you pay less property tax. So that's usually recorded somewhere. That can really help you determine the period of the house, because an addition or subtraction of that one third of the house's area will change the period of the house. If work is done not by permit and the house is trying to be sold, this unpermitted work will often be flagged because there will be somebody who inspects the house to make sure that it's the right size and it's all coordinated. You will have some idea of when the work was done. It's basically between the present and the last sale. But this might not apply if it's a quick claim deed transfer. That might be a little hard to tell because there you're not making any kind of claims to it. So you're not profiting, and sometimes that just passes through. So the quit claim deed is a little bit tricky. Sometimes you have to know a lot about this. And I'm not an expert in that. And it might not be the same from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Usually in the United States, within a state, it's all the same. But two different states, even side by side, may have very different rules. So you have to learn about a lot about that particular area and the house that you want, let's say you want to buy, if this is the whole reason why you're going to move into a new house. Now, if you really want, and you've determined that you have a house facing a certain direction, it has the right land form, and you want to change it to a period 9 house, let's say that's all works out, then you simply buy the house and you're out of it 90 days and you're sure it's a period 9 house. And of course, this applies while we're living in period 9. Okay, we're just at the start of period 9 when I'm recording this, so you'll have almost 20 years to do this. Now, a complete roof replacement down to either the rafters or the trusses, they're structural members of the roof. That will also change the period of the house because the entire interior is open to the air, and that will change the period. And that's good if that's what you want to do. Now, depending on the age of the house, sometimes the whole roof does need to be replaced. That's typically when it's been a bit neglected, and so that too much water has seeped in and it has rotted the what is usually called roof sheathing, which is the flat boards that cover the structural parts. And sometimes you have to replace the structural parts if it's been really long. But that usually means a very rundown house. You can keep your period if you never have to replace the entire roof decking. You can keep the period of the house forever if you wanted to. Not sure that many houses have that happen, but it's possible. Now, most roofers, if they're going to replace the roof, will remove the existing roof entirely and then replace the decking, which is also called sheathing, after everything is down, down to the rafters and trusses. It just makes it easier. You've got people who, just remove everything, and usually it's the same people who put down the new stuff, but it's just easier to do, to replace it or to remove everything and replace it at once. Now, if you have a house that let's say you built it or whatever, it's got a good Flying Star chart that's activated, and you don't want to change the period of the house, and you need your entire roof replaced, you have to be careful. You have to make the roofers, and put this in your contract, that they can only remove half the roof and replace the decking before they remove the other half of the roof. They're going to hate you, but you need to be there. Make sure that's what they do, because otherwise they can change the period of your house. So that is something you need to be cognizant of. But hopefully your roof doesn't need replacement. Usually what will happen is maybe sometimes one piece of plywood has to be replaced. That doesn't change the period of the house. Maybe it's an OSB, either one. It has to be replaced, but not the whole roof. And that's fine. And usually what you're just replacing is the shingles, or whatever the top thing is, and the underlayment, the stuff that makes it waterproof. That's usually all you replace. And that does not change the period of the house. So as long as the house has been kept up, usually the period does not change. Now, if you want to buy a house and you can see the underside of the roof from an unfinished attic in that house, you may be able to determine the age of the roof without professional help. Prior to 1928, all roof decking was dimensional lumber, like 2x4s, or even 1x4s, or 1x6s. It doesn't seem to be 2x. There actually seem to be 1x, because you're just making a surface for which to put on your, usually, tar paper and your shingles. Now, not all houses built after 1928 have plywood when newly built, but a very good portion of them do, because plywood's a lot cheaper than dimensional lumber. So it would have to be a house built by a very rich person if they still wanted to go with the dimensional lumber. Now, plywood is actually better than dimensional lumber, but you know, tradition, some people would prefer tradition, and so they might, even after 1928, would go with dimensional lumber. It would be unusual, but it's possible. So if a house was built prior to 1928, if it was built or re-roofed between 1928 and 1963, most likely the entire roof will have plywood sheathing, because that was the cheaper thing and it was good quality. I mean, most of it was anyway. But houses built or re-roofed after 1963 are very likely to have a combination of plywood and OSB, or only OSB. Now, OSB, it stands for oriented strand board. That's the real name for it, the name that a builder would call it. But lay people often call it particle board, because it looks like just pieces, glued together, which it actually is not very far off of the correct description, but they actually orient these chips from layer to layer. So it is oriented. So here's an example of what you would see. Now, this is outside looking down on top of the roof, but it'll look quite similar when you're underneath the roof looking up. This is dimensional lumber. Now, there is, like here, this is definitely a piece of tar paper that didn't fully come off. It's just ripped where the nail was, because the nail, it's maybe a little hard to see, but there's a green nail right here. And that would some indication that that might actually be a copper nail, because copper turns green, when it gets too much oxidation. I'm not sure, but it might be. This area here actually looks like it's a hole. And this area here is a, this is the wood's grain. So this little area popped out. It just deteriorated, maybe got a little bit wet and just, dropped that little piece of wood. This is probably not enough to cause problems, but this probably is because that's like a half a size of a shingle. So this probably needed re-roofing. Now, you could just replace this one board. The rest of this, maybe this board too, or maybe only a portion of this board. This roof is in actually pretty good condition. I wouldn't be surprised if they did not re-roof this. They didn't take everything off and start over. They might not. So this is something that is sometimes a little tricky to look at. If you can find a place that has a gap like this, if you see the underlayment, it could be tar paper, and then there's nothing on top of it. If you see another board, that means they just took like plywood or OSB and put it on top of this. That is a possibility. That is not a re-roof because they haven't opened this all up to the sky. So so if you see a lot of dimensional lumber, very, very likely it's a house built and roofed and has not been re-roofed since 1928. So it's prior to that, and it's probably the original period when the house was constructed. So that can be very helpful because then you really know that unless you can find other evidence that the house was empty for a long period of time, you have a house with a very old period. Now this is an interesting photo. They are putting down plywood. I can tell it's plywood. Uh, and you see these boards here. I mean, doesn't cover the whole surface, so this wasn't necessarily the surface on which they placed the shingles. Now, if this was a metal roof, maybe it was. But I have a feeling because when I look over here and look every place else, I don't see any wood on these vertical things here. These are the probably rafters because I think this is a pretty old house. Um, Trusses are more engineered and much more recent. So these guys, I don't see any wood between these two underneath that top surface. I think that this wood actually stabilizes the position of these rafters. So this wood here, this brownish wood, is structural. So this would be considered a re-roof because this is the structural part. So they took down whatever was maybe on top of this before, and they're re-roofing it. And this does look like a rather rich person's house just because it seems to be rather big. Hard to tell though. But if it might be from a long time ago, so if you look and you only see plywood, it could be more recent. I mean, the more expensive people would insist on plywood. Plywood is a bit more resilient and tougher, and it can handle the small leaks here or there much better than OSB. So, but it's hard to tell. So I don't know. They don't. I mean, I tell you exactly where this comes from. They don't tell you when this was done, but or even where it was done, which is fine. But I would like to know when it was done. But you can see that this is being really put over this wood. It's not like the wood is replaced and they're putting plywood over the rafters. This wood is going to be there still. So you would see gaps in this wood from under, and you would see the plywood between those gaps. Then this would mean it was re-roofed between 1928 and 1963. And hopefully you can find something about that. If you can't, there are still ways to deal with this, and of course the easiest way if you want to change to the current period is simply be out of the house 90 days. So there is ways to deal with this if you really want to. This is OSB, oriented strand board, particle board if you prefer. Now I look over here, this looks like this is the original stuff. Maybe it's that same, well, it's not the same company, but maybe this doesn't look like this is particle board. It doesn't even look like it is plywood. It looks like it is, you know, 2x or 1x4s or 1x6s. If this is a garage, an attached garage, and the rest of this is house, and all the house part is re-roofed with the particle board or OSB, this would be considered a re-roof because the garage, if it's not heated and cooled and not used, as part of living space, it is not part of the house as far as feng shui is concerned. And because the garage has, for ventilation purposes, has openings that never are closable. That's to keep you from being poisoned with carbon monoxide, basically. So this is important to know. This is not really enclosed, and that's why a garage, in general, is not part of the house. Unless you've actually truly converted it to living space. And there, you usually have to do special ducting, or you have to somehow separate the furnace from the rest of the living space. And that part, but that's usually a relatively small part, is not part of the house. Then, if that's the case, if this is where you actually live, then this hasn't been having the period change, because this is the old structural stuff, not structural. This is the old roof sheathing. So this is very complicated. I can't tell you when this house was, what this period would be, or at least range of periods, because I don't know what is underneath this part of the roof. But you will know that when you look at your house. So there are times when you will not be able to see the underside of the roof decking or the roof sheathing, whichever what you like to call it. If the attic has been completely finished, that is, you've got drywall up and all this stuff, if you wanted to know, you would basically have to remove some of the gypsum wallboard, which most people call drywall, and remove the insulation to be able to see this. Now, this is not something you're going to do if you're buying the house, you haven't bought it already, or if you're renting. So if that's the case, if you're a renter, well, as long as if you don't plan to live there a long time, this is not so important. There's other things to look at. But if you're buying the place, see if the current owners have any photos prior to the finishing of the attic, so that you can actually see what's on the underside of the roof decking. And that will help you determine a period. Now, all this work is important if you are going to own the place and plan to live there longer than a few years. Some people will live in a place for a few years, and they'll maybe they don't want to rent, and they have enough money to buy, but they get a job change or something, and they kind of have an idea that they are going to be moving again, and so but they still don't want to rent, because when you rent, you don't build any equity. So that's possible. And if you're not going to be there long term, it actually, don't worry about this too much. If we can't figure this out, there's a couple ways to deal with it. But if you're only going to be there a few years, as long as the house has a good facing direction for you, or has several other good features, like the main door faces a good direction, that your headboard where you're going to sleep is in a good direction, your range is in a good location and has a good direction for you. If all those things are true, then I'm not too terribly worried if you're only going to be there a few years. And the same should apply to you. And really, if you're only going to be there a few years, maybe you don't worry about the period, because you're not going to have long-term effects from this in general. So now, a foreclosure of a house, and in many jurisdictions this will be recorded, that almost always results in an updating of the house's period, and because this is usually a relatively drawn out procedure. Now, in the US, quite a few houses were updated to period 8 due to the subprime mortgage meltdown. Now, if you know all about this or don't want to hear about it, you can skip ahead a few slides. But most people never really understood this. And so I thought I'd give a little brief thing. Now, lenders pushed adjustable rate mortgages, and we were pushed with one too. When we went to a lender, the first thing they did is write up an adjustable rate mortgage. Now, the rate starts very low. The monthly payment is very low, but you can't do a repayment without penalty, prepayment, I should say, that is pay early without penalty. And after 2 years, the monthly payment goes up 7 times. At least that was what would be true for us. And so we were reading this thing before signing it, and we asked about it, and they said, "Oh, you just refinance." And now it was a pain to get the time to be able to finance this because we were so busy. So we both just said, why would we want to do that? And of course, there's no good answer to that. And, he didn't have an answer for us anyway. And so we just said, no, no, we're not signing this. We want to have a fixed rate mortgage. We want to know what we're going to pay every month. We did pay about $200 more a month, but we did not have a prepayment penalty, and we knew we were going to prepay at least some of it. So, pay early, that is. So, that was a much better move. And of course, a lot of people were able to afford bigger houses than they would otherwise have been able to afford because they were on this adjustable rate mortgage. Unfortunately, when the interest rates rose, the people could not refinance because they didn't earn enough money for the new rate that they would, because they have too much house. And their monthly payments would then skyrocket to that like 7 times the original price that they were paying for those 2 years. And of course, they lost their houses. Now, we didn't because our mortgage rate did not change. And in fact, when the subprime mortgage hit, we had already paid off the house. So, because we paid early. Now, inheritance can also lead to a period change unless the person was already living there when the already living in that house when the owner had passed away. Because sometimes it's a kid who comes to take care of their parents. And so this this can be if it's a different circumstance. Now, any absence of 90 consecutive days also leads to a period change. Snowbirds, which is what we call them here in Arizona, people who come to a southern state, or it could happen in Europe too, I suppose, during winter. They don't want to deal with winter, so they come south and they stay for usually 4 or 5 months until it warms up where they're from, and then they go back. And they're out of the house for 90 consecutive days, definitely, and their house will be updated to the current period house. Now, right now, it's still probably, if they have a house that they've done this for a long time, it's still a period 8 house, most likely, unless they did not go back until, let's see, February, March, April, until like the beginning of May. If they went back in the beginning of the May, it's probably changed to a period 9 house. But otherwise, we'll have to wait until the next winter for it to change the period, because May is kind of a bit late. Most people are back in their northern house before that. Now, if someone house sits, the period will not change. But if someone occasionally checks on the house, maybe every week or so, for a brief time, they make sure there's no broken windows, there's no frozen pipes, nothing that is significantly damaged, or that has been broken into or whatever, then the period will change because this is not somebody living there. They're just checking to make sure that the house is okay. So, and they're usually in there and out in a very short time. Now, when I come across this type of uncertainty, I spend a fair amount of time talking to the client, and at times we look at the history of the area, such as hurricanes, tornadoes, anything that really caused a large disruption. And that can help understand what the house has experienced. And if there's been, let's say, a hurricane that damaged many, many houses, oftentimes it is you're out of the house for 90 days simply because you can't get somebody to come in and fix the house quick enough. It's just the list is too long. Now, sometimes this kind of information can be found in the local newspaper archives, like for big storms, but it can also just be the memory of the people living in the general area. Now, if you are planning on living in such a house with an uncertain period of time, and you want to live there, uncertain period, I should say, you don't really know what period it is, and you want to live there long term, you know, 5, 10, 20 years or whatever, then we can often narrow down the house period to between maybe just 2 periods or 3 periods. Then I say it's time to let the universe tell us which one it is. And we do this in a very serious way with a client. We would do this usually, unless they're local, we would do this through the internet, and we would have a little period of calming down, getting into a Zen or a kind of a sage mode, as Joey Yap would call it. And then we would say to the universe, we need to know the period of the house. We have, and you would write this down before you do it. If it's, let's say we only have 2, we're going to flip a coin. If it is a period 6 house, let's say, this is one possibility, it'll be heads. If it's a period 7 house, it'll be tails. And you have this written down so you're clear and you read that out. And then you flip the coin and you trust it. This is how I would do it. Now, if it's 3 possibilities, we would roll the dice, even one, the other. That is how I would do it, because it's well, actually, if it's a possibility of 3, it'd have to be like 1, 2, and then 3, 4, and 5, 6. So you would have the 3 different possibilities. So anyway, this is how I would do it if I were to come across this where we could not determine the period. So far, I have not had that happen, because for these places, usually there's enough evidence that we can pin down the period. Now, not knowing the exact period is, if you're not going to be there long term, is not absolutely crucial. And that's because as long as you have like good directions, the house is generally good for you in terms of the energy coming in. You may still have a really good special formation that's activated, you just don't know it. But if you don't have that, if you work hard, you can still progress. And then you can move to a house that maybe you have a much better idea of what period is. Remember, the Flying Star chart tells you the outside opportunities. And that is part of the period. I mean, was dependent upon the period, what your Flying Star chart is. The Chi chart is also needs the period. The purple-white does not. So you can still know what's in the house with the purple-white, even if you don't know the period of the house, because the purple-white is independent of the period. So this can still be useful. You can, and if the house has good facing directions and stuff for you, good locations in terms, even if you go to the simplicity of the 8 mansions, which I don't recommend, but just things are in the right direction for you, in general, you can make progress. And once you make progress, then you can find a better house that you actually know more about. And that is what I would do, especially if you don't trust the universe to tell you what period it is. It's okay. You don't absolutely need the period if you are not going to be there long term. And it really depends on how long you're going to be there. Now, regardless if the period is uncertain or not, if none of the facing directions, like the house facing direction, the main door facing, the main door sector, the headboard facing, because sometimes you don't have much choice in certain rooms, the range facing, and that's location is also important there. If none of these can be in a good direction for the client, not a single one, then I usually recommend they move whenever it's practical. And that has happened. So, uh, they said, well, it's really not a great house. There's a little bit of good here, but there's a lot more that isn't suited to you. And so keep, when you're getting closer that this, and it was just a rental, when the rental runs out, a month or so before, really start getting serious looking for a place that's better for you. And of course, I tell them what they should be looking for. So, uh, so then, I mean, really, if you're not going to be someplace long, the period is not as important as you may think. Um, as long as you have something good in terms of facing directions and locations for the important things in your house. So, and we can also look at sun, her feng shui, like what are the landforms. That all becomes much more important when the period is really uncertain. But I have not come across the place where I had to do a coin roll or a coin toss or a dice roll because it's usually pretty clear after we do some research. So this is how I deal with this when it's an old house. And you can do this for yourself. And you could even do the coin toss or the dice roll if that's what you're down to. You just have to do it seriously, write down what the rule is, and follow whatever it is. The universe will tell you what's right. If you have to trust the universe, of course, but you're the same, you know, make this tell me which one is right. Because usually you can can bring it down to, you know, 2 to 3 periods, usually two. And so it's not too hard to do. So that's basically it. I'd like to thank you for watching. Please feel free to leave a comment if you like, or you can email me. And and I do have some feng shui charts if you're interested in this. Of course, the flying star charts, you find those for free all over the place. I don't have any of those, but I do have some purple white and some Chi Min charts at my coffee store. Thanks again for watching.